In this video, we're going to look at the kinked demand curve and model in oligopoly. Now, earlier videos have concluded that the behavior in oligopoly can be complex, and in order to try and capture that complexity, there are many models on offer to help us illustrate some of the things we know about oligopolistic behavior. Now, Ken, in earlier videos, took a look at game theory and price leadership models to show how oligopolists are mutually interdependent. When they make their decisions, they have to be conscious of the decisions made by their rivals. And because there's so few of them, they can gather information about those rivals relatively easily. We also saw through the game theory illustration or model that there is a tendency for collusion to exist in oligopoly. It pays oligopolists to collude and even to merge, because in so doing, they end up avoiding the maxi-min solution, and they come up with a maxi-max solution. In other words, they act as a monopolist when they act together. However, if they do collude, and there are lots of illustrations in the real world of this, there are incentives for each oligopolist to cheat, because in so doing, they capture some of the market share. Finally, there is a preponderance of non-price competition in this market form, and of course that is much more difficult to model, but we'll see here again in the kinked demand curve that there is clearly an incentive as well to undertake non-price competition. Now, the kinked demand curve illustrates another fact which has been shown to be the case in oligopoly, and that is that prices tend to be sticky, and that oligopolists are reluctant to engage in competition that involves price changes, because such price changes can lead to price wars. Now, the kinked demand curve shows a kink in the average revenue curve, which illustrates that the demand is more elastic for price increases than for price decreases. Why is this the case? Well, it's argued that if the oligopolist drops his price, he won't gain a lot of market share because others will match that price change. On the other hand, he'll be reluctant to increase the price, or she will be reluctant to increase the price, because there'll be a loss of market share as others don't match that price. Okay, let's show how this curve looks like, what this curve looks like, and show how it's derived. Here it is. So here we have the kink at the prevailing market price. This is the price that all oligopolists face, in the case of duopoly, both. And you can see that it's more elastic for price rises than for price falls. So if one oligopolist raises their price, they lose relatively large amounts of sales, whereas if they drop their price, they don't gain as large a percentage. So now, if we assume that profit maximizing is the order of the day for this type of market form, how can we show that? Well, we know that we have to find the marginal revenue curve that's associated with this kinked average revenue curve. And although many textbooks don't do this, it may be useful for us to quickly look at how we can derive the marginal revenue curve. And we do this by extending the average revenue curve for this section of the actual average revenue curve, we show it with this red line, and then derive the marginal revenue curve by taking half that distance. The intercept here, half this distance. In other words, the marginal revenue has twice the slope in a linear demand curve. And if we then say, well, we're only interested in this section, so we have to only consider that portion of the marginal revenue curve. So for this upper section, the marginal revenue curve will be just this section here. So the marginal revenue curve's here, below the average revenue curve, as we would expect. What about the marginal revenue curve for this section of the average revenue curve? Well, we can do that again similarly by extending this demand curve up, deriving the marginal revenue curve, and then noting that we're only interested in the marginal revenue curve associated with this section below the price line. Remove the green curves, and we have a kinked demand curve with its associated marginal revenue curve that has this large gap. So that suggests that when we put in the marginal and average total cost curves in on the picture, then profit maximization at that price will take place where marginal cost, which is shown by this curve, equals marginal revenue, which in this case is that level there for this particular oligopolist, and this particular oligopolist will earn this amount of profit, shown by this lilac area. Now, the interesting thing is the gap suggests that there may be other oligopolists who have lower price structures who are still maximizing profits at QM. So they sell exactly the same amount, but in their case, of course, they make much larger profits, as shown by this larger rectangle. So this market form, in a sense, tolerates firms that have different cost structures. This firm is more efficient than the earlier one and therefore makes more profits, but the price stays the same because the firms are reluctant to engage in price competition. So that, of course, suggests that there's going to be increased emphasis on non-price competition, because price competition is destabilizing. Price wars can be fatal. And of course, when firms talk about the characteristics of their goods or the packaging, or they make competition on the basis of packaging or bundling the goods together or whatever, it's difficult for their rivals to exactly match that type of competition quickly. Not as, in other words, you can change the price kind of instantly, whereas you can't change the nature of the packaging or the advertising about your product to match your rival's product, etc. So non-price competition is much more difficult to match. And of course, oligopolies are able to afford non-price competition because they're invariably large and they have large resources to be able to do the advertising and the marketing, whatever, or the product development required to change, to change their non-price competition stance. Now, this model, of course, does explain one feature of oligopoly, and that is the price stickiness and the reluctance of oligopolists to fight wars, price wars. However, it has been criticized because it's not obvious how that initial price was arrived at, the initial price at the kink.